I'm David Brown. I teach courses in American history at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, and I've written a number of books, including this past year, the publication of A Hell of a Storm, Battle for Kansas, The End of Compromise, and the Coming of the Civil War.
Well, thank you for joining me in this discussion, and I'd love to begin by talking about the way you structured the book and how you decided to kind of focus on some of the tangents that were happening around the Kansas Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas. So, how did you determine who to include, what to leave out, and what did you find most interesting when researching?
Sure. So this book was kind of baking for a long period of time, long gestation period. It didn't take that long to research and write, about 3 or 4 years. But I knew that I wanted to do something with Henry David Thoreau and with the publication of Walden, which occurred in the summer of 1854. And I was also aware that there was a book written by a Southerner that published just about the same time, within a few weeks, George Fitzhugh, Sociology for the South. And these were very much, kind of different books. And so I always found that attractive and intriguing. And of course, 1854 was also the year that the Kansas Nebraska Act was passed. This act had the potential to open up the entire Western territories to slavery in territory where it had previously not existed. So I framed it really, around these two contrasting books, Walden and Fitzhugh's book on the South, and look for something to, to sort of give it a bit of a flesh in the skeleton. And that was the Kansas Nebraska Act. And so in some ways, I think both books, because both men were working on these books really up to the time of publication, were also influenced by what was happening in 1854.
And maybe that's very interesting. I was very intrigued by the sociology of the South, and wasn't something that I had heard of before. So I'd really love to kind of start to unpack that in a minute. But let's talk first about the frame of the Kansas Nebraska Act and Stephen Douglas and Salmon Chase and kind of the political machinations that were happening around this time.
Sure. So Western Territory, it was taken in the late 1840s through war and a treaty with Mexico. And Congress had a difficult time figuring out what to do with some of this territory. They eventually decided that they would allow not Congress, but actually the settlers to decide what was going to happen there, despite the fact that the U.S. Constitution says that territories are under the prerogative of Congress, not individual citizens or collectivist citizens. So a handful of years later, there was a desire to open up an older territory. This was the territory that was brought into the Union in 1803 with the Jeffersonian purchase of Louisiana. And there was a desire among Southerners to open this territory up for slavery. By the Missouri Compromise, this territory was closed to slavery. Now, if Southerners got their way, it would be opened. And you mentioned Stephen Douglas, congressman, senator from Illinois. Some would refer to Douglas as a doughface, meaning a Northern man with Southern principles. That is someone who was, kind of willing as a member of the Democratic Party, as someone who himself aspired to be president one day. And we need Southern support to do that, to do what he could to appease Southern sensibilities. So what Douglas does is he takes this principle of popular sovereignty, which was used in the Compromise of 1850 to allow settlers to determine what would happen with territory taken in the Mexican-American War, and to do the same thing now in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska territory. And so the title of the book that is A Hell of a Storm, and that's a phrase that Douglas uttered when he was thinking about this. He said, I understand it's going to be controversial to try to make it possible for slavery to enter these territories. It will create a hell of a storm. I should say this about Douglas. He never really believed that slavery was going to go into the territories, either because this was sincere or because he had managed to convince himself that because of the climate, slavery could not exist that far north. Of course, slavery, servitude, debt peonage, whatever you want to call it, historically, has been able to exist in many different kinds of climates. So I'm not sure how sincere he was, but it's something that he had to be able to say to people in Illinois, which is, we're going to move to theoretically open this territory up to slavery, but we're really not giving anything away because this isn't the Cotton Belt, this isn't the South, the climate won't allow for it. But just the fact that for Northerners, this was a potential opening, an enlargement of the institution of slavery. The nation's future looked to be at stake, and so there was terrific opposition to this bill, particularly among people in New England.
And then Solomon Chase is kind of posited as his foil in the book. And I'd really love for you to talk about the Gideons Appeal and how that kind of I was fascinated by that very short document, but it had some resonance throughout the rest of the book, I think.
Sure. You mentioned Giddings. This is Joshua Giddings, an Ohio congressman, who was an abolitionist at a time when very few people were abolitionists. Salmon Chase, at this point in time, wasn't an abolitionist, but he was leaning in that direction. And so Giddings and Chase and a handful of others, about 4 or 5 others, no more than that, in Congress, they sign a petition on appeal. And this comes out right about the time that they know that Douglas is going to unveil his plans for the Kansas Nebraska Act. And they're incredibly opposed to this plan. They make the argument that, in fact, America is a country in which free labor and freedom in general should predominate. And if we have put up with the institution of slavery, it's always been with the understanding, this isn't exactly true, but it's always been with the understanding, they would like to say, that slavery was going to be contained, that would not expand, and therefore, over a number of decades, it would die out. But the fact that slavery is now potentially expanding into the southwestern territories that were taken after War with Mexico, now potentially into the Kansas-Nebraska territory, which again was just a massive area, the lands of the former French Empire in the American interior, going from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River. This demonstrated that slavery was in fact on the move. And so this group, among others, will begin to refer to the South as the slave power. And so then there's this question that historians have asked ever since. To what extent was there a slave power, and to what extent was this opportunism? Was Chase, and his colleagues, were they being a little bit paranoid here? The consensus, though, is probably not. Southerners were acting, operating in their self-interest, and certainly had a fairly well-organized idea about how they wanted to see the area develop. This came into direct conflict with how an increasing number of Yankees increasingly embodying the aspirations of men like Giddings and like Chase came to see this bill and therefore came to oppose this bill.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I want to stick with politics for a little bit longer because I think it's something that we lose in popular history conceptions is that the politics on the ground very much feel like politics on the ground. And we lose some of that, like when you were talking about Stephen Douglas, the idea of this Yankee who wants to be president, so he understands he has to appeal to the South. And slavery seemed very cut and dry when we think about it today. There were abolitionists, there were enslavers, and they were at odds. But the reality is very messy. And the political parties were very messy. And some of them didn't make it, the Whigs, for example. So would you talk a little bit more about how slavery played into these aspirations of individual politicians, but also political parties and national movements, and how consolidation of power kind of was beginning to take shape?
Sure. Yeah, I think that when we think about partisan politics and political systems, slavery plays a large role into this. So, for example, we talk about the emergence of political parties, the first party system in the 1790s. And we say, on one side, there's Alexander Hamilton, there's the desire by Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury to create a kind of a fiscal military state, which would enlarge the powers of the central government at the price of states' rights. And it would create a more industrial, financial centered economy. And the opposition was, it was national, but it was largely Southern in its origin and strength. And this was when Madison and Jefferson opposed Hamilton's plans. And we call this the first party system. Obviously, Madison and Jefferson represented Southern sensibilities, thinking about an agrarian culture in tension with the kind of urban industrial culture that Hamilton was really projecting. We see in the second party system, you mentioned the Whig Party. This is the Whigs versus the Jacksonians. The Jacksonians will come after the Jeffersonians, but the DNA is somewhat the same. A party that's national, but really, in its orientation, is strongest in its leadership positions with Southerners and Southerners who held slaves. And we see in that second party system a bank war. Jackson will veto a national bank, unlike the kind of national bank that Hamilton had proposed in the 1790s. And Jackson will do this in the name of the workers. It'll also do this, I think, in the name of states' rights and in the name of an agrarian hard currency, cotton crop vision, not industrial, not financially centered. And so this is really, a huge part of American politics, from the drafting of the Constitution up into the Civil War, which is that political parties have to be sensitive. The Jeffersonian parties, the Jacksonian parties, under the rubric of the Democratic Party, of the institution of slavery. In the 1830s, the Democratic Party agreed at their convention that it would require at least 3/4 of all delegates to support a nominee. That meant that Southerners, a small section by this time, compared to the North, would always have a veto power over any candidate that would get the nomination for the party. This meant that individuals like Martin Van Buren from New York, Stephen Douglas, who we talked about, Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire, and James Buchanan from Pennsylvania, if they won the nomination, if they won the presidency, they had to make themselves cooperative on the issue of slavery. Some kind of already were in a way. Franklin Pierce, he had lots of Southern friends. I didn't really see slavery as a great evil. I'm not sure that Buchanan did either, but they had to be right on that question, or they would not have the opportunity to be president.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating because some of that debate gets lost in the shuffle of the bigger issues that we sometimes focus on. And kind of shifting gears again, because we were talking about the expansion west, but you also talk about the expansion south and the less successful push into Cuba and some of the weird characters that like invaded Mexico. And there was this push too to not, we think of the westward expansion because it succeeded, but there are these other kind of more futile attempts. So could you talk a little bit about Cuba and the Ostend fiasco and that kind of movement?
Yeah, sure. So American foreign policy really changed after the War of 1812. It had been Atlantic facing. The United States had had 2 wars with Great Britain, all but a war, a quasi-war, a naval war undeclared with France. But as American power begins to move into the Gulf, then this opens up the possibility of adventurism. And so, for example, before there's the attempt to by private American citizens to invade Baja, California, and take it, to invade Northern California, which, by the way, the United States would kind of officially do with the war in Mexico, when the United States positioned a U.S. Army in Mexican territory. And people at the time knew this. In his memoirs, Grant called this the most unjust war ever. Abraham Lincoln was a one-term congressman when this happened. He wrote to his law partner back in Springfield, Illinois, William Herndon, and he said, "You know as well as I do, that soil was not ours." So before that was done, sort of officially, there were these filibuster attempts in which private American citizens would try to carve out an empire. In one sense, we could say that these were just, Bush League affairs. But in a larger sense, when we look at what happened in Texas, when there were about 20,000 Americans who had gone to this region and swore their loyalty to the Mexican government because that was their new country, they had a revolution there. And this revolution was, kind of sanctified by the United States, which would later first annex and then bring Texas into the Union. There's also the question of Florida. Andrew Jackson, before he was chief executive, he was still in the military. He was given a vague order to put down Native Americans in Georgia. So he goes to the southern border and he sees that Seminoles are crossing over from Florida. So he brings a U.S. Army into the Spanish Empire, and he effectively invades Florida, Spanish Florida, takes over a couple of forts as well. This demonstrated the weakness of European countries in the Western Hemisphere, and it gave rise to these filibuster attempts, and it gave rise, as you mentioned, to an attempt to purchase Cuba, although there were many Americans at this time who actually wanted to just flat out have a filibuster attempt, invade Cuba. What I find interesting about this is it's easy to look back at that, time in the 1850s and to say, well, this is really, part of its time. It's part of the desire to expand the United States into the Western Hemisphere, and on the part of Southerners to extend the institution of slavery. And yet, it was more than a century later, in the early 1960s, that the United States would, in effect, support another filibuster attempt. And this is what turned out to be the disaster at the Bay of Pigs, when our government was supporting anti-Castro forces in an attempt to overthrow the Castro regime. And so Cuba has a long history, a fraught history with the United States. In the 1820s, Jefferson wrote to his neighbor, then President James Monroe, saying, we need to have Cuba. We need to have Cuba. And after California was brought into the Union in 1850 as a free state, for Southerners, Cuba took on an added importance because it was thought at the least it would be the next slave state, if not perhaps carved into a couple of states, which would then give the South presumably 4 additional U.S. senators to advance the cause of slavery.
And that metric too is sometimes shuffled out, whereas expanding slavery is seen as economic and moral, but it's also representation in government that we don't always register. So let's now turn to the culture and how all this politics started to inform and bleed into novels and poems and, as you say, Henry David Thoreau and George Fitzhugh. So let's move into that sphere. So if you could kind of talk about how you structured your research and what you found about that.
So I was very much interested in the culture, particularly literary culture, how these quote unquote representative figures thought and wrote about the era. So there's the chapter on Thoreau. There's the chapter on the kind of the self-made sociologist George Fitzhugh. There's a chapter on Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, but really more broadly how she thought about the institution of slavery as a New Englander who was really coming from an evangelical tradition. And so increasingly, I think you find in the antebellum period, there's this intersection of anti-slavery and what we might call romantic writing. That is, writing that is unequivocal in its opposition, its moral opposition to the institution of slavery. That did not always mean that these individuals were necessarily ultra progressive on racial questions. Harriet Beecher Stowe was not. If you've ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin, she still defers to a lot of the tropes that negatively stereotype African Americans. When the novel comes to an end, essentially the African American couple that we've been following throughout the novel, they're going to be politely encouraged to go to Africa, which means that she has cleanly extricated the problem. And that word was used a lot. The problem, the Indian problem, a slavery problem. It was never the master's problem. It was always someone else's problem. So I found that very interesting and also very, very real and very authentic, that these were real artists. Were real writers. They weren't caricatures. And so they were living in the moment. When Thoreau was writing, Walden, there's a chapter on there on African Americans who lived at Walden previous to him. And it's a very instructive chapter in a number of ways because it tells us something about Concord, Massachusetts. We think of the transcendentalists, these extremely liberal people and whatnot, and these African Americans, they were really marginalized. And I think what Thoreau found so attractive is that they were peopling the same area roughly around Walden Pond that he was peopling too. And what he does is, in a sense, he kind of appropriates their experience for himself. And so he includes himself as a kind of a legatee in this long line of people that Walden, took to its breast because those hypocrites in Concord, Massachusetts, didn't really want these people around. So these people, they could write very heroically about the cause of anti-slavery, but still be, as we are, creatures of our culture and living deeply within those moments.
Yeah, and I, having recently just read Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I'm going to have to revisit Thoreau because at the time I read it in high school, I didn't pick up on that theme. But it's amazing to me how much of these tropes have been immortalized and become so emblematic and universal based on these kind of iconic works. And Emerson also had kind of a awakening too to this issue, right?
That's right. He wrote about the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that essentially Northerners, if they were called upon, had to assist enslavers in free states to arrest and to hold and to maybe see through a court proceeding, even if an individual was opposed to slavery, even if an individual was an abolitionist. In other words, that the individual had to go against her or his conscience in the name of advancing the cause of slavery, even in so-called free states. And so Emerson made a great comment about in his journal. This is happening in the 19th century. This is barbaric. I will refuse to agree to this, which he could because he would probably never be prevailed upon because he wasn't sheriff or a jurist to do anything about it. But Emerson comes a little bit late, as many of the Transcendentalists did, to the anti-slavery crusade. His wife, along with Thoreau's mother and sisters, were years ahead of them. But Emerson was a great object for abolitionists to get on their side because he was one of the country's most famous public intellectuals. He lectured widely throughout the country. He lectured in England as well. He had an audience. He was recognized as a bit of a sage. And when he really comes around, it's really in the 1840s, and he starts to address the fact that Great Britain, this monarchy, this aristocracy, they have in fact emancipated their empire, and here the United States is behind the curve. And we call ourselves this advanced democratic civilization, and this all begins to pick up steam in the 1850s when we get closer to the Kansas Nebraska Act.
Yeah, and let's now talk about the other side of the anti-slave movement, which was, I guess, the pro-slavery side, Sociology of the South and George Fitzhugh. Tell us what that is, who George was, and what the work tried to do.
Yeah, Fitzhugh was a Virginian, and his family had come in the 1600s, so there was a long pedigree there. By the time that we get to Fitzhugh, he's the family has pretty much Southern Gothic, land rich, penny poor kind of thing. He's self-taught. He's a self-taught intellectual, and he becomes something of a public intellectual, meaning that he wrote lots of reviews. He published in lots of magazines, and so he was known throughout the South as a serious thinker. He would be invited to speak at places like Yale College, and in Sociology of the South. This is a project that he had been working on and off for a few years, and it's published in 1854. And he thinks that the South has not gotten a fair share. His argument is that, and you could find a lot of people in the North who would actually agree with this argument, including, up to a point, Henry David Thoreau. Because when we think of Thoreau, we might think in some sense that Thoreau was somewhat critical of an industrial process. Well, Fitzhugh was too, maybe for different reasons. Fitzhugh thought that the industrial process, it created its own set of masters and its own set of slaves. Fitzhugh says, in the North, you have slaves too. They're factory workers. And you have enslavers. These are the owners, or these are the bosses. These are the people who determine who will and will not work, who will and will not get paid, who will and will not be able to sustain themselves and have a family. So Fitzhugh is very critical of the industrial process. He argues that this is a process that, along with big cities and democracy, are historically recent phenomena within just the last couple of hundred years. And he says it's uncertain whether these things are really for the best. So Fitzhugh is a traditionalist. He argues for local government, he argues for agrarianism, and he argues for deference over democracy. There are all kinds of reasons why somebody might argue for these things as well. As I mentioned before, Henry David Thoreau might agree with some of this. With Fitzhugh, though, this also obviously comes back to the institution of slavery, because these are the values that will help to sustain slavery moving forward. Fitzhugh understood slavery to be something of an evil. We know this because when the book came out, he was in correspondence with the gentleman, and he mentioned this. But he also said, when you're writing a book and you're arguing a position, you have to be very careful how you do it. So he was saying, I'm aware that that slavery isn't just a wonderful thing, that it does have some negative attributes to it. But he was arguing one side. He felt that the other side, that the northern side was arguing one side, and he wanted to contest it. He wanted to do so on an intellectual level, not on an emotional level. And he wanted the South to have good sociological, historical, data-driven reasons, along with philosophical and ideological, for opposing what America was becoming. As something of a side note, Fitzhugh had a bit of a revival in certain intellectual circles in the 1960s, from Marxist students and professors, and obviously they were not holding up Fitzhugh for his defense of slavery, but it was long said that in the United States there was no tradition of criticism of capitalism, that there was a consensus capitalism was a good thing, and that if you were against capitalism, you were a Marxist, and I think what Fitzhugh presents is a native, homegrown critic of capitalism and a defender of a bygone agrarian vision that, as you mentioned earlier, has sort of. I mean, nobody reads Fitzhugh today, but when you read him, if you go and read him, you can see that there is an anticipation of lost cause mythology. And if you've ever seen, for example, in popular culture, a film like Gone with the Wind, there's a bit of that as well. It's an approach to viewing Southern civilization strictly from the preferred vantage point of, I can't even say the South, and I can't even say the white South, from an elite South, which held the power and held the slaves.
Yeah, and there's this thread too in abolitionist thinking. I don't think you've mentioned it in the book a couple times, but the idea that the enslaved are subject and treated badly, but it also denigrates the white enslaver, and that the master and slave are locked in this constant race to the bottom kind of idea. And it was Fitzhugh that I saw kind of like pushing back against that, saying, "Hey, wait, we have a really good society down here, and it's not so bad, but it's kind of bad."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and Fitzhugh, he also referenced slavery and other civilizations at other times to provide a historical context to insist that, if we call ourselves a democratic republic, um, we're really looking back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And we see this in our architecture with our Doric columns, um, and how we make all those good boys up in Cambridge who are sitting at Harvard learn their Latin and their Greek, and they're not doing this to build factories in Chicago. They're doing this to be leaders of the public, and and so what we need is a paternal civilization in which, yeah, a kind of, so-called what meritocracy, um, uh, when these figures will will be paternal, and they'll provide the right kind of leadership, because whether it's slavery or mass democracy, it's unwieldy and it's problematic, and it will not serve our country best.
And it's amazing that that thread is so, and still is, with us today. I mean, it's not quite the same argument, but it's very similarly built.
Mhm.
I would love to kind of shift now to this dual, um, these two threads of the anti-immigration, anti-Catholic, anti-Irish political movement that starts creeping into this expansionist West political argument, and also the immigration society that happened here in Cleveland, where the idea of a freed African American population does not belong in this country, and how those two complemented and then competed with each other on a philosophical political basis.
It's a great question, and you're right to juxtapose them, because it's very interesting, if not ironic, that you've got this desire, to really, begin to close the doors on immigration. We saw lots of immigrants, principally from Northern Europe, Germany, and Ireland, come into the country, the largest percentage that had ever come into the country before. And there were some Americans, who were very concerned about this, maybe more concerned than at any other time. That's debatable, but what we do know is that, unlike other, concerns about immigration, including in our own time, a political party um, rose up. This is the American Party, sometimes known as the Know Nothing Party. And it wasn't just that it was a party; it was a party that, in 1854, took every state, congressional seat in Massachusetts. That the Know Nothing governor candidate won the election with 63% of the vote. Um, uh, Anti-immigration fervor, particularly in New England, was really strong, really strong. Um, Less strong in the Midwest, but it was still there. At the same time, you mentioned that there were, people who actually wanted to leave the United States, um, African Americans, and there was this great discussion, this great debate about the fate of African Americans. And I've got a chapter in the book on Martin Delany. Delany was an incredible figure, involved in so much. He was a physician, he was a Civil War officer, he was an educator, he was a candidate after the Civil War for a gubernatorial seat in South Carolina. Um, uh, and he was, for a long period of time, a staunch advocate for African Americans to leave the United States, because he argued that racism was going to, trump everything. Uh, Not all African Americans agree with him. Most didn't. Frederick Douglass, and they were cordial. They were on opposite sides of the fence on this issue, but they communicated, they corresponded, they knew each other. Um, but with Delaney, he believed that the best thing for African Americans to do was to go to Central America, perhaps South America. Later on, he toyed around with the idea of Africa, but he never really liked the idea of the quote unquote back to Africa, because that was going to be in a spot in North West Africa, whose capital was Monrovia, named after an American president, an area that was purchased by Americans. And he felt that African Americans, if they went there, they would always be under the tutelage, the thumb, the economic power of these whites in North America, that they truly needed their own place to be. What I found very interesting about this, and ironic, is that in the name of carving out a separate identity and a separate destiny, the way that they went about doing this, which is perfectly understandable and plausible. And you mentioned, what takes place at Cleveland. There's a convention. This is what Americans do. They have conventions. They meet. They argue. They discuss. They debate. They have a keynote address. Delaney gave about a 10-hour keynote address, expounding upon his position, and they put out a bunch of bullet points about what their aspirations are. This is what they did. This is what they did. And for years, they touted the idea that the place for African Americans was really overseas. This will come to an end principally because of the American Civil War. But we see anticipations of future efforts by future African Americans, people like Marcus Garvey, for example, maybe even Malcolm X, to identify the place of African Americans as being someplace else. And so I see Delaney as both historically contextualized in the 1850s, but I also see him as part of a broader Pan-African movement that looks to unite the notion, the idea that Africans outside of Africa have a common interest, a common history, and maybe even a kind of a common identity.
I also found it, I made a linkage in my head between Delaney and Stowe, because Stowe very much ends her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, as you said, with the idea that Liberia is where these people should go, and they should also take Christendom with them. And it's very much a kind of what he was suspicious of, that if it's made by Americans and continues to kind of hold up the values of America, you're always going to be under the thumb. And it just was a fascinating thread connect.
That's right. And some of the back and forth between Delaney and Douglass, Delaney was a little bit bothered because Delaney had written a novel, and it got very little attention in the African American press, and he kind of blamed Douglass for that. And of course, the African American press gave lots of attention to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and in one of the letters Delaney wrote to Douglass, with all due respect, this woman, she knows nothing about us, and then of course, Douglass defends this. Douglass had, of course, his own agenda and his own aspirations, and I think Douglass was probably conscious about playing a longer game than Delaney. I think for Douglass, I think Douglass was thinking 10, 20, 30 years out. And so for Douglass, it was a bit of a chess match. And so how Douglass would advocate for people like William Lloyd Garrison or Harriet Beecher Stowe, it wasn't necessarily that he agreed with everything that they were doing, but to the extent that I don't want to use the term use or manipulate, but to the extent that he could sort of get them to adopt positions, or at least not oppose positions, maybe get a signature here or there. This was beneficial. The man was really Douglass was really, I think, a very effective. I don't really just want to say politician, because that doesn't really do it justice. He was a very effective administrator in lots of respects, for ways that we're probably very familiar with, and then for ways that are less obvious. But if you dig into his correspondence, then you could see the positions that he takes, the nuances, his ability to be strong and yet deferential when it's to his interests. The man was just extremely effective.
I'm glad you brought up Garrison because one of the things that I've always pushed back on recently is the idea that we are in a partisan bubble and we're all kind of in our silos. And this goes way back. I mean, the newspapers and the media that people consumed were incredibly partisan and were incredibly geared toward a point of view. I mean, Garrison's Liberator says in the title what it is and what it's about and the argument that it's going to be every issue. So could you talk a little bit about how the media played out in regards to these what we now see, gigantic literary figures, or at the time not, known to be the legends they are today?
Yeah, so back at that time, there wasn't a lot of pretense about where, say, a newspaper stood. Sometimes it would be in the title, like the New York Whig or the New York Democrat. Uh, and someone might say, well, yeah, at least they're being very honest about it, very, very upfront. And some of these papers, they last for an election cycle, sometimes a handful of years. But even the ones that were bigger than that, for example, Horace Greeley, the editor, the one-time presidential candidate, Henry David Thoreau's informal literary agent, the man was a genius. He held lots of informal roles aside from editing the New York Tribune. The Tribune was a Whig paper until it became, when the Whig Party died, a Republican paper, and it was probably the most significant newspaper in the country. It would be kind of what the New York Times is today. Not quite that big because the circulation wouldn't necessarily, you couldn't necessarily in New Orleans get, a copy off the shelf, but it had that effect. And so Greeley was very much someone who was in demand because his newspaper could speak volumes and it could really push a position. And so, in the book, I've got a chapter on a gentleman by the name of Alvin Bovee, and Bovee was very, very interested in seeing, the Republican Party, that this Kansas Nebraska Act, it was really destroying the Whig Party because Northern Whigs were opposed to it and Southern Whigs were for it. And so the question is, what would take the place of this party? This is all happening within weeks of the bill being introduced. People are leaving the party, and there's just dozens, hundreds of these small little groups, anti-Nebraska parties, people's coalitions, various names. And Bovee prevailed upon Greeley on a handful of occasions throughout the spring and summer of 1854 to have his paper call for the formation of a new party, really the unity of all these fractured northern parties. And Bovee even gives them the name. He said, there's something about Republican. They call themselves Democrats, Republican. Because if you're an immigrant, you're familiar with the name. There's many ways to spell it, but when you come here, there's this one party, and they will recognize it and they will embrace it. And Greeley will eventually do this, not so much because Bovee was pushing, because he wrote to Bovee and said, I can only go as fast as public opinion will let me go. Of course, Bovee was saying, but Greeley, your newspaper shapes public opinion as well, which is also true. Long story short, though, Greeley will back this party. It's not the only reason why the party takes off, but it was critical for major northern newspaper to back the new major northern party. And this is exactly what happens. And so on top of providing, excerpts from abolition speeches, aside from, now it's 1854, so his newspaper has been attacking on and off the fugitive slave law for the last 4 years. It will now back this attempt to create a party which will overturn the 1854 legislation. And of course, during the American Civil War, it will become a staunch advocate of the Lincoln administration. Not uncritical, but still a staunch advocate.
So, how do you wrap the book up? How do you tie these threads together? And what do you see as the kind of lessons of this time period?
Yeah. So to the end of the book, I guess I have to give credit or blame to my editor who asked me if I would write a few more pages. He wanted to know what happened to a lot of the people in the book. And so I do that. For example, James Buchanan, who is in and out of the book in various capacities. By the way, I'm sitting here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So Buchanan's house is about 20 minutes from here. And uh, Buchanan retired at that house. Wheatland is what he called it. And he uh, he was within about 13 miles of an invading Confederate army. This was the invasion of Pennsylvania, the Gettysburg Campaign in 1863. And I include in the book some of his correspondence in which he's making a bold stand to stand his ground and et cetera, et cetera, um, uh, which is what he was accused of not really doing when he was a president and he gave too much to the South. There are figures there like Harriet Tubman. I follow her to the end. Um, uh, I think the fact that she died in 1913, that she died the same year that Woodrow Wilson, who was the first Southern president to be elected since the 1840s, I find that an interesting, kind of congruity. So I tried to follow these characters through to the end, and I also wanted to sort of close on the note that this struggle that they were going through, that this was something I was looking at very carefully in the 1850s, and principally in 1854. But obviously, this is a struggle that started earlier. The first two chapters in the book looks at slavery from the time of the Constitution, and I kind of closed the book by looking at not directly because I wanted to stay tied historically to the 1850s, but to note that we're still wrestling with these questions of the aftermath of 2 centuries of enslavement in our country.